and would surely have had to shout to be heard.
This is what Jesus' roadshow probably looked like, in the hustle and bustle of the marketplace every day, competing with the crowd and the noise and the din of the marketplace. And then Jesus would draw attention with clever wit and storytelling. But it would have been a competitive atmosphere and an interactive atmosphere with questions answered and probably even a few hecklers.
The signs of Jesus' attempts to be heard above the crowd are preserved in the earliest gospel, the account of Mark. We can still almost hear him shout the word, "Listen."
Listen, a sower went out to sow.
There was a practical reason for Jesus keeping his group small.
If you're relying on other people's hospitality, you really can't go into a small village with 50 or so people. There simply wouldn't be enough food.
According to Luke, women later joined his traveling ministry. This also made good sense.
If a group that was only men came into a village or town, the villagers, the townspeople might be very suspicious. But if there are women with those men, then it no longer looks like a threatening group.
The Jesus painted in the Sermon on the Mount is much less vibrant than this new portrait of Jesus. But can we work back from the sermon to discover the real words Jesus spoke to the people of Galilee? The words of the Sermon on the Mount still resonate 2,000 years after the Gospel writers penned them.
You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also.
I've often wondered whether the great one-liners of Jesus simply came to him in the moment, or whether he crafted them. I mean, some of the one-liners are just magnificent. Leave the dead to bury the dead.
But we can't be sure whether these words really left Jesus' lips.
In the ancient world, very, very, very few people could read or write. And so the idea that someone would have captured this great sermon of Jesus as a moment in time is pretty unlikely.
It's impossible to imagine that Jesus actually preached that as a single sermon. There are too many topics covered much too quickly.
Almost all scholars agree that the Gospel writers Luke and Matthew wrote their sermons many decades after Jesus lived, based on oral traditions.
The sayings of Jesus that have been transmitted to us are transmitted in written form. And obviously there is a big gap between what is in written form and what was spoken once upon a time.
Oral tradition is not word perfect.
The people remembering the teaching of Jesus during the oral period, and then the authors of the Gospels, obviously felt free to change the words of Jesus and stories about Jesus. Classic example, the Lord's Prayer is found in two very different versions in Matthew and in Luke.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Father, hallowed be your name. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
These differences between the Gospels may, ironically, hold the secret to discovering Jesus' actual words. A forensic analysis of the discrepancies has led scholars to a timeline for the writing of the New Testament. They believe Mark wrote his account first, around the year 70 AD. Within the next decade or two, Luke and Matthew wrote their accounts, borrowing heavily from Mark.
Matthew and Luke both use the Gospel of Mark when they write their Gospels. And that's why there's so much similarity between Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
These three Gospels are the oldest records of Jesus' words. But in 1838, a German scholar named Christian Weisse discovered unusual patterns in the texts of Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Patterns that sounded like the echo of another author. Weisse laid out verses from all three Gospels, lining up the passages containing similar quotes from Jesus. Sayings like the lesson of the fig tree and Jesus' famous command to suffer the little children. But Weisse found a number of sayings in Luke and Matthew that didn't seem to match anything in Mark. Surprisingly, they did match each other. Weisse at first wondered if they had copied from each other.
We think it's highly unlikely that the author of Matthew knew Luke's Gospel and that the author of Luke's Gospel knew Matthew's Gospel.
Matthew and Luke tell some aspects of Jesus' life, the birth story for one, far too differently for one to have copied another. So Weisse reached an astounding conclusion. There had to have been another written source from which these two authors drew.
Matthew and Luke must have used a text, probably a written text, of sayings of Jesus and incorporated those sayings into their Gospels.
Today, most biblical scholars believe that there was an original gospel predating Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They call it Q, short for the German Quelle, which means source. It seems to have contained hundreds of sayings of Jesus.
One of the interesting things about this document that we call Q is the fact that the document itself does not exist. But we are convinced that it must have existed.
Hidden in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, accounts that usually differ considerably, you can see the shadow of Q's pen.
They're the same basic sayings in many cases, just arranged differently in Matthew and Luke.
Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?
Q can be considered to be sound bites from the teaching of Jesus. Short sayings that Jesus would have said on many different occasions, in many different contexts, collected together into this document.
The parallels are not always word perfect, but well over 100 sayings of Jesus closely match each other in Matthew and Luke, and do not appear in Mark.
Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you.
Academics think whoever wrote Q may well have been an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, and that it consisted entirely of the sayings of Jesus, without any other stories about his life.
One of the interesting things about the Gospel Q is that it is sayings only. So that what you have in Q is a form of Christianity that looked to Jesus more as a teacher of wisdom than as the Son of God.
Of course, without a copy of the text, Q remains very controversial. No other New Testament book contains just sayings of Jesus. But in 1947, two Egyptians unearthed an astounding collection